It is awesome to be back here at HackFest. We've been doing this 10 years. I've been at every single one. Last year I was virtual, but now we're here. And I say good morning to everyone here and in North America. Also, we have thousands of people joining us from around the world. So good afternoon, good evening, good night, sayonara. I mean, hey, this is great. I've got some fun stuff that I'd like to share with you. Really, it's just so awesome to be back on the HackFest stage. So, reframing hard cybersecurity problems for fun and profit. I want to talk to you about hard problems and ways to think about those hard problems and how to solve them. We're not going to actually solve any problems right here. That's for you to do on your own after this. But I want to give you sort of a framework and a set of ideas. And in fact, I'll even call them tools for solving really hard problems. This is based on advice that I have picked up from various mentors in my life over the last 30 years. And I want to share that advice with you. I've kind of curated it all for you here. So my goal is to equip you with some tools, intellectual tools. These are not software tools. They're not hardware hacking tools. They're more intellectual tools for dealing with really hard problems. And I hope you'll take a couple of notes so you'll be able to use these ideas that I've gathered in a hard way over years, and I'm going to present them to you for your use going forward. We have something at SANS called the SANS Promise. Alan Paller, our founder that Steve alluded to, he came up with this decades ago at SANS. And the promise is this: everyone who completes SANS training can apply the skills and knowledge they've learned the day they return to work. And Alan told me this. He was almost like a father. And Alan said, you have to look at every course you write and make sure it answers the SANS Promise. You have to look at every day of every course and make sure it answers the SANS Promise. You have to look at every module of every course. You have to look at every presentation you do at every event, an hour-long presentation. In fact, Alan said, look at every slide and make sure that slide reinforces the SANS Promise. And I want this talk to be just like that for you. All right, cool. Now about this presentation, Steve Sims calls me 6 months ago. He said, hey, Ed, I would like you to do a keynote at the SANS PenTest HackFest. And I said, well, I'm not so sure. And he's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I have to think of a keynote. He's like, oh, just do a talk. It'll be a great talk. And I'm like, I learned something years ago from one of my mentors, Gene Schultz. Gene Schultz is an amazing guy. He actually passed on about 10 years ago now. But Gene Schultz was one of my early mentors. He's the one that introduced me to SANS. And Gene Schultz told me a keynote is not just a normal talk. You know, so what makes a keynote a keynote? It's a little advice for you in your career. You might say, well, keynote is a great idea, or a well-known speaker, Dave freakin Kennedy, all right? If Dave speaks, that must be a keynote, right? Or maybe it's a nifty new technique. Oh my gosh, look at this. You could hack this or hack that. Gene told me, no, it's not that. All of those can make for a fantastic talk. But for a talk to be labeled a keynote, it needs to challenge your thinking about things and change the way that you think about something. Only then should it be called a keynote. And I do get requests where somebody will call me and say, hey, could you do a keynote? Dave Kennedy called me for DerbyCon. I keynoted it several years. One year he called me and says, can you do a keynote this year? And I said, I don't have a keynote for you, but I'll do a talk. He's like, well, that doesn't matter. I'm like, oh, it does. I will give a talk, but it is a talk and not a keynote. Because I didn't have something fundamentally that would change the way people think or give them intellectual tools to change the way they think about stuff. So I also found it quite interesting. You know these products, right? Apple's product for doing presentations is called, you know this, right? Keynote. Thank you. You can talk. You can actually talk. Whereas Microsoft's product for doing this is called PowerPoint. Really? So think about that. Apple's product is named Keynote, whereas Microsoft's product is sort of slides-based and it's very presentation-based. So even these two products and their logos, notice that the logo for Keynote is focused on presenting at a podium as though you were giving a keynote, whereas Microsoft's is, well, I guess you're doing some slides or something, right? So I thought that was kind of an interesting little subtlety. Maybe they heard from Gene Schultz as well, right? So I tried to make this a keynote for you to kind of challenge the way you think about certain things, especially problem solving. Now, you can do this. You could take a non-keynote talk and try to reframe it and dress it up as a keynote. This is not wrong or bad. You need to think about the meta thing to change people's ideas around stuff, and then add a few slides at the front and at the end. So you can take a non-keynote and turn it into a keynote, but you have to think about how to do that and do it carefully. All right, so my keynote for SANS PenTest HackFest 2022. Reframing. I really love to reframe ideas, to kind of just take a step back and think about things in a very different fashion. And I have an example. Actually, I've got a few examples here just to introduce the idea of reframing for you. I'm sure you've all heard of reframing and such, but let's get very specific in particular. One of the things that we've been doing for about 20 years now is the SANS Holiday Hack Challenge. Steve Sims mentioned it earlier. And in the Holiday Hack Challenge, we introduce a little storyline where some holiday supervillain is trying to destroy the holiday season, and you have to help Santa and the elves diffuse the situation and fix things. Holiday Hack Challenge is coming up this year. Me and my team are working on it every day. We're pouring immense efforts into it. It's going to launch second week of December. Wait till you see it. But part of my reframing of ideas follows along with Holiday Hack Challenge. So back in 2011, Holiday Hack Challenge had this title: Grandma got all hacksaw by a reindeer, or did she? And I was looking at the story from the song, Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer, and obviously the reindeer is the menacing figure and Grandma's the victim, right? And I thought, okay, that's kind of cool. We'll make Rudolph the bad guy and of course runs over Grandma. But then I thought, what if Rudolph is innocent and was framed by who? By Grandma. Why? For insurance fraud. So SANS Holiday Hack 2011 was all about insurance fraud and setting up Rudolph to take the fall. We reframed it, you see? Let's just take the story of Grandma and the reindeer and flip it on its head. Or in 2017, we did one called Winter, based on that play Wicked, right? In the play Wicked, you find out what you thought was the good witch is actually the nasty one, and what you thought was the evil witch from Oz was actually a pretty good person. So we kind of folded that in here, and when you start Holiday Hack 2017, you think the abominable snow monster is trying to destroy the North Pole. But as you investigate it, you realize it's Glinda, the good witch, who's actually the cyber villain. Or in 2018, that was our first ever KringleCon. We're going to launch KringleCon 5 in a couple of weeks here. But KringleCon 1, here you walk into the North Pole, Santa Claus greets you, Santa Claus then disappears, and Hans Gruber comes out, and Santa's castle turns into Nakatomi Plaza under invasion, just like in the Die Hard movie. And you work your way, you fight against the toy soldiers, you get your way to the end, you've got this evil Hans Gruber, and when you get to the very end, Santa Claus comes out, standing next to Hans Gruber. The entire thing was a setup for you. Santa was testing you through this scenario to see if you have the skills needed to protect the North Pole. So we flipped it. You thought Hans Gruber was the bad guy for the first 95% of that challenge, but it turns out he was Slugworth, hired by Wonka, also known as Santa Claus. You see, it's reframing, it's taking these ideas. In fact, one of the guys who used to be on my team, his name is Dan Pendolino, and he said this to me: I love how other stories' heroes are our villains, and our villains are drawn from other stories' heroes. Flip it on its head. Try to think about it in a very different way. This is reframing. Another expert class I got on reframing came from Alan Paller himself. He had so many jewels of wisdom that he shared. He did pass away November 9th, 2021, so it was a year and a week ago. And one of his main gems of wisdom was this, and he would say it to us all the time. We at SANS still say this to each other. If you can't fix it, feature it. Big issue, big idea here. Now, there's a couple things embedded in this. First, there are things you can't fix. There are hard problems that are intractable. But that doesn't mean you stop. If you can't fix it, you feature it. Now, what does that mean? You might think, oh, put lipstick on the pig, right? Celebrate your problem and maybe they won't notice. It's P.T. Barnum, isn't it, right? No, he didn't mean that. He meant take your problem, admit that it exists, and come up with a clever way to address that problem. It still exists, but maybe you can figure out a side channel. Maybe you could figure out a way to take part of that problem on. And Alan's big problem that he devoted his life to was building the cybersecurity workforce. And he created several things to do this. One of the things that he created was something called the SANS Institute. You should look into it. And the SANS Institute originally was created it was very interesting. They would do conferences. Not conferences like SANS does now. It would be a 2 or 3 day conference with speakers for about an hour. It was almost like our summits today. The original SANS in the early 90s was that. And it did fine, but it had a big problem. And Alan was frustrated by this big problem. He wanted to have the cybersecurity workforce consistently applying cybersecurity principles. But you'd have one speaker saying, here's how you secure Windows. Another speaker an hour later would get up and say, no, here's how you secure Windows. And then another speaker would get up and say, no, they're both wrong. Here's how you secure Windows. And Alan's like, this is not good. So he transformed SANS and said, let's come up with multi-day tracks where we can get consistency by getting concurrence from the industry. Here's how you really provably secure Windows to make it as secure as it can be for that era, right? And then, of course, I remember this was back in 1999. Alan kind of ran up to me. He was bouncing. He kind of bounced when he had a good idea. And he said, Ed, I've got it. What we're going to do is we're going to create certifications for these various different disciplines, incident handling and firewalls and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, we don't need certifications. CISSP already does that. And he's like, no, but they're not going to do it at the level that we're going to do it at. And we're going to do it based on the consistency of how to harden security that SANS is teaching, and we're going to call it GAC. I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. Then I remember shortly after that, Alan bounces up to me. He says, Ed, we got a really big problem. I'm like, what? He's like, Y2K is coming, and what if security falls apart? I'm like, well, gee, I don't know. He said, what we really need is a giant sensor network. I don't know, 10,000, 20,000, 40,000 nodes across the internet that will sense various attacks, including that night of December 31st, 1999. And that way we'll have incident handlers around the world ready if something goes bump in the night. And I'm like, how the heck are you going to do that? I'm going to hire Johannes Ulrich. He is a PhD in physics, and he's going to run the Internet Storm Center for us. And that's the origin story of the Internet Storm Center. That's how it came about. And it still exists today, and Johannes is still running it. And then I remember fast forward, I don't know, maybe to 2005, 2006, Alan came to me. He was bouncing up to me, and he says, I've got an idea. What's your idea? It's about the cybersecurity workforce and that very difficult problem. We're going to create a college. A college? Yeah, because that way, instead of somebody just taking a class here or there from SANS, we can immerse them in a curriculum so they can become expert penetration testers, expert forensics people, and so forth. So we built the SANS Technology Institute College. So my point is, Alan was taking this big, hard problem, which he never solved in its entirety, but he took chunks out of it and moved things forward in a very significant fashion. And frankly, he is my inspiration. This picture of him, I have that actually hanging up in my office. And I look at him almost every day and say, what do I do now? How do I solve this problem? Right? So that's Alan Powell. All right, so there's types of hard problems. Let's kind of start peeling this thing apart. It might be a technology problem. The technology is just not fast enough, or there's not enough memory or storage space or something like that that lends itself to this. Or the algorithms are so complex. Maybe it's mathematical, this problem. It could be NP complete, right? I mean, you can't directly solve it at any sort of scale because it exponentially explodes. But maybe there's heuristics we can apply. Or maybe it's economics. It's just the economic drivers, the incentives don't work out here, or there's just not enough money to do it. It could be psychological problems. You know, the psychology of the human mind can't deal with certain things. Or maybe it's sociology, where you have multiple minds working together, not getting along. Or political, where they really don't get along. Or maybe it's organizational in the way the organizations are structured. Maybe it's emotional. Maybe your problem is actually a bunch of these combined together. The problems I often deal with are technology. Sometimes they have some mathematics in it. They're often economical. And there's usually some sociology in the problems I have to deal with. All right? So these come up in our work on a day-to-day basis. So what are we going to do? We're going to reframe the problems. And I have my own definition of reframing, but I decided to say, well, what do other people say reframing is? And I found this really good definition from the Center for Human Capital Innovation, okay? They're a consultancy that helps you get the most out of your people. They'll do like individual consultants or also for a whole organization. They say this: reframing is looking at a problem and finding a new way to see it so you can discover possible solutions for the problem. That's cool. And it can be applied to all kinds of problems, but I want to focus on really hard problems. So how can I take this problem that everybody understands is a problem? It could be a personal problem you have, or it could be an industry-wide problem. And how can I deconstruct that problem, reframe it, and come up with possible solutions? Now, you might be sitting there saying, wait a second, dude, I saw a bunch of great talks yesterday, and they're all about hacking all this stuff. What does reframing hard problems have to do with hacking? And my answer is everything. Reframing is the very essence, the lifeblood of hacking. The hard problem of me getting shell on your computer. I want to reframe that. How could I get shell on your computer? Well, it's really hard to do it directly, but if I could trick you into clicking on a link, then I might be able to get it, right? So it's a way of life. The very definition of hacking involves reframing hard problems to manipulate technology and or people to do something. So this is the essence of HackFest. Also, a little bit more background on reframing. There used to be these parties at DEF CON. And the first ones I went to was in the late 90s, and I went up there through the early 2000s. They were called Caesar's Challenge Parties. Anybody here ever been to a Caesar's Challenge Party? They rebirthed them like in 2013 through 2017, and I hope they come back again. The idea is this, at least this is how it used to run back in the day. At DEF CON in Vegas in August, at 11 p.m. Saturday night, it was invitation only, 50 to 100 geeks would be invited to a party. At 11 o'clock it would start. Open bar, nice music, this and that. At midnight, Caesar, also known as Riley Eller, would come down and give us a hard problem to work on. That would be at midnight. He was often late, sometimes 12:30, 1 a.m. You know how it goes. And then we just start working on it in teams. There'd be 50 or 100 of us, so they're like 5, 10, 20, 30 teams, and we're just working on this problem, trying to come up with a solution to really, really hard and really interesting problems. We'd work till 6 a.m., 8 a.m. It was crazy stuff, but I loved it. Loved it. And I was honored to work with my team, my friends, on these very hard problems. There were all kinds of interesting problems he had. I don't have time to go into a bunch of them, but let me give you a couple of short, brief examples. One of them was, consider this. You need to write a stack-based buffer overflow, the simple stuff that IoT is still vulnerable, as Steve Sims pointed out. So simple stack-based buffer overflow, that's it. But it has to run on 2 completely different CPU architectures with completely different sets of opcodes. And it needs to give shell access. So exec a shell. How do you do that? And we were working, thinking about it. There's 2 parts to the actual solution, though. One is to come up with a single opcode number that on both different CPU architectures, say one is x86, the other's ARM, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? 2 different architectures. The same number of that opcode is one instruction on one CPU, and of course, a different instruction on the other CPU. And it should do effectively nothing. It doesn't have to be a no-op. It just can't really do anything big or it can't jump. It just got to kind of fall through. It might increment something in one architecture and in the other architecture, I don't know, it's a relative jump to the next instruction or something like that. But something really simple that just falls through. That's your no-op sled. You just put a whole bunch of those opcodes up front. And then Greg Hoagland came up with a genius move. You need to think of you need to find another opcode that in one CPU, that number of instruction will just fall through. It might do something, but it can't do anything big. It just falls through. Whereas in the other instruction, for the other processor, it's going to be a relative jump down. Put that in there. So you got your no-op sled, you've got your little thing that'll fall through for one CPU, for the other CPU, it'll jump down. And then you put your shell code for the first CPU at the top and the second CPU at the bottom, and you go. That's it. Neat. It was a hard problem at the time, but they solved it. That was cool. Another one that was included in a party like Caesar's Challenge Party was this. Here are the complete works of William Shakespeare. You got them. And they gave you the text, right? What you need to do is pretend you're an x86 processor, and you need to start going through that and find the longest sequence anywhere in there where if you execute those instructions, you don't crash, nor do you jump out of the set. Now you might say, well, thank you for treating William Shakespeare's work as code, but why is that practical? Because if you can solve that problem, if you can emulate a CPU to that level in any sort of solvable time that's not NP complete, you can do all kinds of other interesting emulation things, right? So there's pretty cool stuff. There was communication system design. I love Caesar's Challenge Parties. They were a true choice thing in my life in solving hard problems. All right, so let's approach this practically. How do you solve hard problems? First of all, let me tell you what not to do. Don't focus on the problem and why it's hard. Get your mind out of that because that'll slow you down. Don't think about the problem on its own terms. Try to get out of it. Don't think about attempted solutions and why they fail. You got to open your mind, right? Don't rely too much on the experts. They know the problem's hard. They'll tell you it's hard. They'll tell you all the solutions that don't work, and they'll tell you it's just a hard problem. It can't be solved. Don't feel limited by resources. You're going to see in a minute, I'm going to say, remove some of your resource constraints and see what happens. Those constraints might be serious and real, but relax them or eliminate them for a little bit so we can open our minds. Don't get stuck. Don't get frustrated. Don't get annoyed. Don't get depressed. Don't give up. A certain relentlessness to this is important. So some tips for reframing. Free your mind, Neo. For those of you who know me very well, especially back in the day, you knew there's going to be a Matrix reference somewhere. All right? Free your mind, Neo. Think of several different approaches to identify possible solutions. Like I said, remove some constraints. Maybe money is a big constraint. Lift that one. What if you had infinite funds? Could you solve the problem then? You know, I hear NASA does this. Imagine it cost you nothing or very close to nothing to get something into low Earth orbit. What would you do if that happened, if you had that capability, right? Or imagine if thrust were 10 times more powerful than we currently know. What kinds of problems could you solve? Where would that take you? Or maybe you have limited resources, maybe human capital and such. Lower those constraints or eliminate them and see if solutions might come forward. You still have to deal with them, but that's for later. Think hard. And what you're searching for is the Eureka moment. And I'm going to give you some tools later for how you can prepare for the Eureka moment and maybe trigger it. Now, you can't be guaranteed a Eureka moment. They don't always happen. How many people here have felt that they've had a Eureka moment at some point in their lives? Is that the most amazing feeling? It's incredible. I've had it a few times in my life, and I'm going to talk to you about some tools you can use to prepare for that Eureka moment and maybe trigger it, but no guarantees, all right? You also need to have mentors and people that you can trust to run your ideas by. So this is building a group of friends, a group of peers, a group of even superiors, mentors that you work with that you could trust. And you need to debate them. You need to wrestle with them, but always in a friendly fashion. Be a contrarian, but not a curmudgeon. Oh, this is a really important thing. I see this happening in some of my friends' careers. You know, I have a lot of friends that are curmudgeon. What is my definition of a curmudgeon? It's an old grumpy person, right? Who's very smart, but they're old and grumpy, and they love being old and grumpy. What I'm starting to see in some of my younger friends is they're becoming curmudgeons too early, and it's hurting their careers. It really is. I'm not going to name any names here, please, that wouldn't be appropriate. But be careful not to become a curmudgeon too soon. People seem to accept a certain curmudgeonliness from people in their 50s or 60s or 70s or beyond. But if you're 20 or 30 and you're starting a curmudgeon path, people will remove from you opportunity, and that's not good. You want those opportunities. So I think the secret to being a contrarian without being a curmudgeon is to have a light touch. Stay young at heart, remain playful, have a sense of humor about yourself especially, but about others. Have a sense of humor about the absurdity in the world. You've heard this expression, only the good die young, right? What does that mean? Most people think of it this way. If you're a very good person, you will die young. Well, I mean, that's what it says, isn't it? Let me reframe that for you. Think about this. I heard this from a philosopher once, and it blew my mind. I'm actually getting chills right now even thinking about it. What if only the good die young is not actually the chronology of when you die, but it's the spirit with which you die? Only the good die young. You may be very old chronologically, but you still have a young way about you because you're good. You see what I'm saying? Another way to rephrase that is only the good die young at heart. Don't become a curmudgeon too soon. Now, notice I'm not ruling out becoming a curmudgeon. I might myself someday become a curmudgeon, but I'm so young now that, well, let's not even contemplate that, right? Only the good die young. Oh, really? So think about it that way. Only the good die young at heart. The power of collaboration among peers. Now I'm going to start getting into, hey, I'm going to apply these ideas, give you some new ideas, and give you some stories of where I've benefited from these ideas. You want, I mentioned earlier, surrounding yourself with smart people, mentors, people that you could collaborate with, people that you can be a contrarian to and help you tease out ideas, and they'll make you better. First of all, surround yourself with people smarter than you. That's what I do. I already have one me. I don't need anybody as dumb as me. I've already got me. I need people smarter than me. And never, oh, here's a hugely important tool for your life. Never think you're the smartest person in the room, because that will start closing down doors. I've had really hard problems that were solved by somebody, or at least the solution was suggested by somebody that most people didn't think was very smart. Sometimes people who aren't very smart can actually open doors for you for really amazing solutions. So don't discount them and in your mind say, well, that person's not smart enough to solve my problem. They might actually be, right? And realize that sometimes the solutions to really hard problems can be found by that person, or at least they can trigger in you that thing. I've tweeted this before, and I really try to live by this. I always assume I'm the dumbest person in the room, and everything works out just fine, right? And let me tell you about a dinner I had, a life-changing dinner. It was Sands, New Orleans, October of 1999. So 23 years ago, right? And we went out to dinner, and it was one of those Cajun places, and they had butcher block on the table, you know, the butcher block paper, and they had pencils and stuff so we could write down there. And I was with Marty Resch, you know Marty, right? Invented Snort, created SourceFire, that kind of stuff. Chris Hawk, you know, Beaker. He's been a CISO, he's done all kinds of stuff. Stephen Northcutt was there, running Sands at the time. Gene Schultz, my other mentor I mentioned earlier, was there. And we were faced with this dilemma. We saw our careers starting to change. We loved doing technical work, but we were being pulled into management, being pulled into sales, being pulled into this and that. And what we did is we drew on the table one line, and that's where we stood now. We drew another line on the other side of the table, and we called it Nerdvana. What is Nerdvana? Nerdvana is where you can do really great technical work that you really want to do and make really good money doing it. So how can we go from this point in our careers to get to Nerdvana? And we planned all these different routes. Marty said, well, I'm going to take Snort and I'm going to commercialize it, but I'm still going to give it away for free. And he kind of planned his route. Beaker was talking about going into management, CISO kind of stuff, but still staying technical by doing these projects on the side. We were talking about how could you create intellectual property by creating something that could be patented, or maybe you could write a book, or I don't know, write a Sands class, right? So we had all these different paths to Nerdvana, and we had all these people that are absolutely more brilliant than I am, thinking through those paths and evaluating each other's paths. This is a hard problem to stay technical and move forward in your career in a very fulfilling fashion, and that Nerdvana dinner influenced me profoundly. So collaboration among peers. You also want to think about the real problem. It's possible that the problem as framed in your head is not the real problem, or even as the problem is discussed in the industry. There's a more real problem, a meta problem that precedes your problem, that if you solve the meta problem, you actually solve the real problem. This is actually a friend of mine and a mentor, Radia Perlman. The woman is a genius. She created the spanning tree algorithm, just really incredible stuff. And she and I would debate about things. She has this capability of really coming to what's the real problem, this sort of meta problem, the problem underlying things with simplicity. You're thinking about it too hard. You're over-engineering your solution. You got to take a step back. There's a simpler approach here. And I remember debating with Radia about SYN cookies as a solution to SYN floods and denial of service attacks. And we debated back and forth about SYN cookies and whether they were a real and elegant solution to the problem. Just an amazing way. So think about the real problem. Maybe you aren't thinking about the right problem. Next, slice and dice your problem. Maybe your problem can be broken up into smaller pieces that you can take on. Think of Alan Paller and SANS, GIAC, Internet Storm Center, and the SANS Technology Institute College, right? Or maybe your problem can be broken up over time. There might be a certain temporal nature to your problem. You're focused on what happens in the middle time, but there's an earlier time that you could address the problem. Something happens before your problem manifests itself, and maybe you could fix the conditions there. Or maybe there's something that happens afterwards. Or maybe you can dig away at your problem at different angles simultaneously. By the way, I'm absolutely fascinated by the stuff that Ashton does here. I think this is so cool. In fact, while other presenters are presenting, I'm like watching Ashton's stuff. This is so amazing. So just look at that. Look at, there's a little pie there. I love pie. So thank you, Ashton. Or is it Kate? No, it's pie. All right, next. This is big. Think about other problems that have been solved for which there may be an analogous solution, okay? You know, Ada Lovelace had some really interesting comments and thoughts on that. I'm never really satisfied that I understand anything. Maybe if you understand this enough, you can analogize it into something else. Some other problem in a different industry, a different walk of life, something like that. You can analogize to that. Look at their solutions and then adopt those solutions into your own problem. Let me give you an example here. We were doing an IoT pen test several years ago. It was me, it was Josh Wright, it was Tim Medine. This was the Counter Hack company working on an IoT pen test, and we found a vulnerability. It was an awesome vulnerability. It was so good. So it's against an IoT thing. I can't tell you what it was, but a common IoT product. And we found this vulnerability that would allow complete pwnage of the product, just devastating. And it's based on the nature of what the product was, which is why I can't really say what the product was. But not only was that product vulnerable, the entire class of products in that whole industry was vulnerable. This is great. Josh Wright found the flaw, called me and said, hey, look at this. I'm like, oh, great, great. All right, so write it up. He's like, yeah, that's the problem. What's the problem? I don't know how to solve this. What do you mean you don't know how to solve this? Just sprinkle some crypto on it and this and that. Oh, no, we can't do that. These devices are very cheap. So they have impossibly weak processors and absolutely minimal storage. So we can't just sprinkle crypto on this thing because it can't do the crypto necessary. And if it did any crypto, it would be so weak, it would be trivial to crack like within seconds. So I'm like, okay, Josh, Tim, Medine, do you have any solution? How can we do this? And I said to Josh, let's analogize. How do other systems solve this? How does Diffie-Hellman solve this? Is there something we can learn from Diffie-Hellman that maybe we can apply here without applying Diffie-Hellman? Or Needham-Schroeder? Anybody remember Needham-Schroeder? Like a precursor for exchanging crypto information? Or MIT Kerberos, the real Kerberos? Or Windows Kerberos? Windows Kerberos, right? How do they solve them? And we went through all these different solutions, and we came up with nothing. And can you deliver in a pen test, here's a massive vulnerability that blows your product up and your entire industry, we have no solution for you other than to quadruple the price of your product. Good luck. You can't do that to a customer. So I remember we were at Sands Orlando, and man, I was not sleeping well because this is a big problem. How do you solve this? And I remember day one, I came up with a solution. So I texted Josh Wright and Tim Medine, a couple other guys on the team, saying, hey, what about this solution? And Tim's like, no, it won't work because of this. Damn, he's right. So then we get to day two. I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I got it. I think I know how to do it. So I text it to Tim and Josh and the other team. Hey, what about this? What about this? And Tim's like, nah, that doesn't work because of this. And I'm like, oh. But then Josh Wright texts again. He's like, actually, wait a second. We can get around Tim's hack of Ed's solution by adding this to Ed's solution, and then it'll work. And Tim's like, no, it won't. And Josh is like, think about it. And I'm thinking about it. It's like, oh my gosh, this does work. This fixes the problem. Holy crap. We told our customer that, and we had a solution to their problem. And then we looked a year later, and the entire rest of the industry had reverse engineered their product with the solution, and everybody uses that solution now. This is a wonderful feeling as a pen tester, but it's a hard problem, and we did some analogizing. Now you might say, well, what was the solution? Let me just say this. Your IoT devices are often controlled by an app running on a phone. GPS on the phone saved our butts. There's a lot you can do with GPS information so that if the IoT device, the target IoT device, doesn't have very much storage, you got to push things back into the phone, and GPS saved our bacon. That's all I can say about that. All right, so how can you prep for the Eureka moment? Sometimes you have a hard problem and you need a Eureka moment. You need just like, hey, I just split the atom. I just escaped the VM, whatever it is. You can't make a Eureka moment, but you can plow the fields. You can plant the seeds. You can get ready for the Eureka moment. Let me give you an example. We got a contract back in 2007 from the Department of Homeland Security. You have $1.1 million, and 1 year, your job is to escape VMware, right? You have to run code inside a guest machine, blow a hole through the bottom of that, and get code execution on the underlying host operating system. This was not in a hypervisor environment. This was just standard VMware on a workstation. That's, well, you got to walk before you run. We'll do the hypervisor later. Anyway, we worked on a contract basis with Matt Carpenter. We hired Tom Liston. Tavis Ormandy worked on this project as a subcontractor. H.D. Moore worked as a subcontractor. And I divided the problem up. I said, Tom Liston and H.D., I want you to start working from inside the guest, beating your way out. And then I said to Matt Carpenter and Tavis, you work your way from the host and try to find your way in. But at the same time I was doing that, we sliced and diced it. I said, we're going to need certain things if we are able to get our Eureka moment. We're going to need a comm channel that can go back and forth very reliably between guest and host so we can ship things like shell commands and stuff back and forth. So I asked Tom, listen, could you create VMCAT? It's netcat, but between a host and guest operating system, assuming you had code execution on both of them. Because you executed code in the guest, it was able to escape the VM. That's the Eureka moment that we didn't have yet. And then execute code on the host. You get VMCAT on both sides. And then you have just reliable channel communications. So you see, we prepped the ground. You hack from this way, we'll hack from that way. And if we can escape, here's the stuff I'm going to need, assuming an escape has happened. And then we worked hard. And it took us about 9 months to escape VMware. And we finally did. And we demoed it at a SANS conference. It was SANS Vegas in 2007. Now, some tools for triggering your Eureka moment with magic. Are you ready? Magic. It's not just magic, it's magic, okay? Define your magic hour. When do you best come up with Eureka moments? When do you do your best thinking? It could be any time, really, but define a time in your own head and tell yourself, this is when you do your best thinking. This is when you do your best problem solving. For me, it's usually 5 or 6 a.m. Or immediately before the sunrise, right? And then identify your magic place. Now, they don't necessarily have to coincide. I'm usually not at an Olive Garden at 5 or 6 a.m. But there is an Olive Garden. I'm telling you, it's magic. It's on Route 35 in Eatontown, New Jersey. And that Olive Garden, whenever I'm sitting there eating some tasty food, I get ideas. Problem solutions come to me. It doesn't really matter if your magical place isn't really magic, but telling yourself you are in your place at your time to solve your problems will help plow the field so the Eureka moments happen. Maybe it's sitting on the pot. That's when you do your best thinking. Don't stay there too long, it's not healthy. Okay, but still, maybe that's the best. Maybe it's in the shower. You don't want to stay in the shower too long, but still, if that's your magic moment, define it as such and convince yourself that it is such, because you're more likely to have your Eureka moments. Okay? And I remember one time I was sitting at that Olive Garden, and I'm sitting there, it's like, I've got netcat on a target Linux system. I've got command injection flaws, but netcat, when it's installed on most Linuxes, doesn't have the -E option to execute a shell and connect it to standard in and standard out. And I'm like, what do I do? And they're like, wait, what I could do is I can inject in to launch a shell. So now I have redirects. I can use that shell to invoke netcat, but I have redirects. So then I can just redirect standard in and standard out of a shell into that netcat. You don't need -E as long as you've got shell redirects, right? So I'm all excited. I'm sitting at the Olive Garden, solve this problem, hack the customer, and I tweet, hey guys, if you have netcat without -E, as long as you can execute a shell, here you go. You got all your redirects already. And if netcat's on the target box without -E, you got that. Robin Wood, Digi Ninja, he responded back saying, dude, where were you 2 weeks ago? Right? So it's fun. That's the magic of that Olive Garden. Another thing to keep in mind is 80% solutions are awesome. Jeff McJunkin actually referred to this yesterday, not in these terms, but he said you don't have to entirely solve problems to actually have a really good solution. Do you remember early efforts? Some of you are old enough to remember this. Remember early efforts to fight spam? And they weren't all that great. But the fact is, instead of getting 1,000 spam messages in an hour, you only got 200. And people were like, this sucks. I still got 200. Yeah, that's bad, but it's better than 1,000. Or maybe, your particular defense against attacks. Steve alluded to all the different exploitation defenses built into Windows today. Maybe they're not 100%. There's ways to get around them. But if they can help drain the swamp, if you can get rid of 80% of the problem, then we only have to focus our resources on the remaining 20%. So sometimes 80% solutions are a stepping stone to something better, or a stopgap measure that lets you buy time, or 80% solutions might change the economics of it so the problem now becomes solvable. I learned this from a mentor of mine named Frank Kramer. Frank Kramer used to be Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Bill Clinton, and he told me he loves 80% solutions. Right? Because they also might open the door to a 100% solution, but you got to do the 80% first before you realize the solution for the whole problem. An example I will give you here recently was the Colonial Pipeline attack with a ransomware. Remember, it was what, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, something like that? And that was the first high-profile case where the FBI was able to claw back some of the cryptocurrency paid to the attackers. They weren't able to claw back 100% of it. And that was one cybercrime case. But it was a game changer, because suddenly the criminals were like, dude, the FBI can take some of our money back. We don't like that. And a lot of that influenced a lot of things. That ransomware is still a big problem, but it's much less of a problem because of that game-changing clawback that some really brilliant people in law enforcement achieve. 80% solutions are awesome. You also need to think, while you're trying to solve your hard problem, about side channel attacks. I alluded to this earlier. A full frontal assault on your problem might not be possible. So think about modern cryptography. If you're going to attack the algorithm, good luck. You're going to need a PhD or 2 in mathematics and be genius level. Go for it. But look at side channels, timing attacks. This is for cryptography. I do this and it takes longer to encrypt a 1 bit than it does a 0 bit. Oh, that's interesting. Tells me something about the key. Or power analysis attacks. It turns out it takes more power to encrypt a 1 or a 0 or what have you. Or various glitching attacks. If I can clock glitch, I might be able to get it to spit out some information or intercept some RF emanating from your chips. I'm not going after the algorithm. I'm going through side channels or bus sniffing. You might be able to sniff information passed across the bus that might actually give you a key or something else. Perhaps your problem, I'm using an analogy here, your problem might not be cracking cryptography, but your problem might have a similar kind of solution with a side channel. So think about that. Next, embrace hacking ugly. And I have a picture here of my good friend, Tom Liston. Tom is an absolute genius, and he's a dirty hacker. He has come up with solutions. He's the one that escaped the VM for us. And when he tells you how he hacks something, it's like, man, that is hideous. That is ugly. But it worked. Sometimes your solution doesn't have to be elegant. Sometimes your solution might be brute force or unintuitive or inelegant. I mean, yes, Radia liked the simplicity of her elegant solutions, but sometimes a solution is perfectly good if it's just hideous. And that's Tom Liston's approach. I've often said this before. Let's say, heaven forbid, there's a nuclear bomb in a city and it's going to detonate, and I get to choose 2 people to hack that thing to stop it. Well, let's say I get to choose 1 person. So what am I going to do? My choices on my team, I got Tom Liston and I got Josh Wright. You know what I'm going to go with? Tom Liston every time. Because he's a dirty hacker. He doesn't care about elegance. He just gets it done. Now, I told Josh Wright this, and Josh was like, well, hey. And I said, Josh, you'll write up the report. Because you're a far better report writer than Liston is. See, this is good. It's teamwork. So don't worry about the ugly hack. Hacking ugly is fine. So let me give you a couple of hard cybersecurity problems and a start at reframing. Just to start, I'm not going to solve the problems for you here, but attackers only need, you hear this said all the time, attackers only need to find one way to get in. We have to defend against every way to get in. Right? This is a problem. It's true. Here's a potential reframe. Once an attacker gets in, they have to stay hidden every day. You only have to detect them once to know they're there. Reframe the problem. Their problem is actually not totally different from our problem. And we can use our problem to diffuse theirs, right? All right, problem. They need to get lucky once. An analogy, the first problem. They need to get lucky once. We have to stay lucky day in and day out. Well, they have to remain hidden, like I said before, right? So we can detect them just once. Or another problem. You hear this all the time, right? There's no patch for human stupidity. The ultimate unpatchable flaw is our users, but we can reframe that. Our users could become an intelligent, distributed detection engine if we inform them properly with the appropriate knowledge and skills. So different potential reframes, you need to think that way. So I went to my team and I said, hey folks, I'm doing a presentation on really hard security problems. You tell me what the problems are. I'm not going to solve them. I just want to know what you think of as very hard problems. So Chris Elgie from my team, he's the one sitting at the end of the table, the far end. The difficulty of cooperating across organizations in cybersecurity. Now, Chris Elgie is he's a lieutenant colonel with the National Guard. He also does a tremendous amount of work for us, as a security consultant. So he sees different organizations. He has a lot of interactions with the Army itself. So he knows about this coordination across different organizations. It's hard. It's hard. Chris Elgie actually gave me 2. Malicious influence operations in social media. That is indeed a very hard problem. That might be the hardest problem we're dealing with right now as a society and culture. I mean, that is a huge one. I don't have a solution for you, but that's a hard problem. And you're going to just have to take piece parts of it, right? Eric Persley from my team, so while LG is in the Army Guard, Eric Persley is in the Air Guard. And Eric Persley said passwords are the ultimate vulnerability, and they're everywhere. Even though we do multi-factor authentication, once you side channel that or get beyond that, everything's passwords, and then you just laterally move throughout the organization. The dependence on passwords is still a massive problem and stain in our industry. Melissa Joyner from our team, she is on loan to us from the Air Force. Absolutely brilliant lady. She's got her PhD in cybersecurity stuff. Melissa said, increasing cybersecurity knowledge at all levels of our culture. Some people will tell you, well, look, the average person shouldn't have to think about cybersecurity. Well, how far has that gotten us? Is there a way that we can educate people so that there is this sort of culture of cybersecurity, at least at a certain level, that will fundamentally change the world? Lynn Schifano from my team, she's the one that helps us recruit new people and hire people. So at the forefront of her mind is the cybersecurity workforce development. It's the Alan Paller problem I talked about earlier. How do you get very good people into this industry and place them in fantastic jobs? And then Josh Wright, you heard me mention him many times. How do we motivate the will to embrace change in cybersecurity? We're too stuck in our own ways, says Josh. How do we get people out of that? So in conclusion, think about the hard problems you faced in your career so far. Did you solve them? Maybe you applied some of these tools already in solving them, or maybe you have a hard problem you're working on right now. I hope I've given you some ideas on the Eureka moment, the collaboration, the mentor, analogizing your problem, 80% solutions, side channel attacks, hacking ugly. Use those tools to try to address your really hard problems. And it made me think of this guy, Albert Einstein, right? In 1905, he wrote 3 papers. One was on Brownian motion, one was on the photoelectric effect, and the third was on this little thing called special relativity. Einstein reframed all of physics in 1905 with those 3 papers, and they're amazing. He thought about the problem completely differently than anybody had before that time. And I have a picture of him in my office, and that's me with good old Al. So apply these ideas systematically. And that's going to open up a tiny bit of time for Q&A. That's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope it helps you out.